Let me echo other speakers and thank the organizers, the organizing committee, as well as staff and everyone else for their incredible work in bringing all of us together from a very diverse perspectives. What I'm going to do specifically draw on my experience in health communications, particularly working with vulnerable audiences. Vulnerability is very different in my context, where we are focusing on issues such as class, race, ethnicity, and place. And I will be speaking specifically from those experiences, drawing on our work, right? So this doesn't need any introduction to anybody. We have these wonderful two major revolutions in life sciences and in informatics, which is leading to advances in development of availability of tremendous amount of information. That's not a surprise. The question that drives the research in our group is, are the benefits from these revolutions accruing equally across population groups, right? That's what has animated most of our work, and that's what I will be speaking about today, right? So what I will do is I will talk about 4 communication challenges and try to offer 4 solutions. Otherwise, it's very depressing to just talk about only problems today, right? So the first one is not a surprise. I think my prior speakers have done a very good job in identifying these platforms. I think David started speaking about, especially about internet, and the way this information is spreading in internet and social media. I think the challenge here is, because of the social technologies, is that and this is particularly relevant for the work we do, is that whatever we do in controlled research settings, whether it is in public opinion surveys or in experiments in the lab or in the field experiments, the challenge is, once it leaves that controlled research settings, what happens to that piece of data, right? That is the challenge we are dealing with in the real world, the so-called real world. What happens to it and how it is interpreted and misinterpreted. And for the people, if you think about it, I think there is a tremendous amount of information deluge. I think it's flowing from every which way. So for us to think, we are interested in a particular type of information and communicating about it, whether it is in fact-checking or politics or vaccines. But from an ordinary person perspective, if you are sitting there at home dealing with what we call as daily hassles in life, this is too much information, right? You are drinking from the firehouse, number one. Number two, we don't have enough people like Laura and others who are important critical gatekeepers, which we used to have very powerfully, to check this information, right? This becomes a bigger problem, I think, right? So that's one. The second challenge is the production of science and health information is not, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, in the realm of scientists, right? So even though we are out there, we have conventions like this, meetings like this, we have all kinds of fora, journals and platforms to produce science and health information. So one group, obviously, for getting this information out is journalism and journalists, which has been very good in my view, particularly has been very helpful, despite the challenges and problems. I think this critical gatekeeping function has been very important. However, what we tend to forget is the private sector communications, right? The private sector, particularly products that what we call as risk-producing industries, also communicate quote-unquote science, right? And what they do is they influence perceptions of risk or promote social norms and risk behaviors in a much more powerful way because of sheer volume and money than we do, right? And the role of private sector drowns out the so-called accurate scientific information. So let me give you a couple of illustrations, right? These are the 3 biggest problem industries, right? Fast food, sugar-sweetened beverages, which have been attributed to the major crisis in obesity in our country, and of course tobacco, right? So if you look at how they communicate science and how much time they spend, these data are difficult to get, but if you look at the data, they are spending money to communicate, miscommunicate, or if there is such a word, discommunicate science, right? And the question you have to ask is, can we counter this kind of a decibel level when it comes to science? No wonder we are having trouble, right? No wonder we are having trouble, because this is what they are doing in their communications of science and health, right? And then our activist and interest groups, I think we began that conversation with vaccines, a world in which I live in as a former member of the National Vaccine Advisory Committee. Of course, it's in vaccines, but you take any of these controversial topics, whether it's nanotechnology or nanofoods or any GMO, there are activist and interest groups who are also communicating, right? And of course, these activist and interest groups have much more powerful effect. As an example, Jenny McCarthy, who for some reason is more popular than I am, so she has obviously a greater reach and a greater influence on certain sections of the population. And this is worldwide. I'm taking a very global perspective, not just a US perspective here, right? So in summary, science communication is done not just by us scientists or those of us in the scientific establishment, but mass media, private sector, and activist interest groups, right? A third challenge, as we have began this conversation, is information is not communication, right? Every day there is a study du jour which says either coffee is good for you or coffee is bad for you. As someone who drinks coffee a lot, coffee is actually good for you, let me tell you. A colleague of mine from Harvard is actually publishing his review, and it will show, I have checked with him. I wanted to make sure he gets the right findings. So coffee is actually good for you. But ordinary people have to be worrying about this because they are seeing this finding or study du jour, right? Or, did you know this? Why you should not stand and drink water? This is not, especially in the global world, it's not about these establishment social media organizations, but this is on WhatsApp, right? WhatsApp is one of the most widely used social media platforms in the rest of the world, right? Or, I'm sorry for the doctors in the office and in the room here. If you have gone to the medical school, you have been wasting your time. And this is the kind of information that goes around. And there is an interesting thing that happens as you look at this. What people say is forwarded as received. I'm just forwarding this. I received it from, they're pretty much absolving themselves of any responsibility. But if you start paying attention to it, you see it all the time. So the consequences are very clear. For example, 50% of the people in the survey we did, in the national survey, agreed that everything causes cancer, and 15% said nothing could reduce a person's chance of getting cancer, which is not true, because we know that 50 to 65% of the cancers can be prevented, but on and on. And there is an inaccurate understanding of disease etiology. I took the slide out for time, but if you ask people, what are the significant reasons some people suffer from diseases, they all attribute it to lifestyle. But we know from social determinants of health literature that social contextual conditions are as important, if not more important, in contributing to ill health, right? So the last challenge, which is my favorite, where I have spent a bulk of my career, is in health and communication inequalities. Communication, like health or wealth, is unequally divided. At a macro level, certain groups have greater power in generating, processing, and distributing health information, or unhealthy or mishealth information, compared to other groups and institutions. I just showed you examples of tobacco industry and sugar-sweetened beverage industry. At the individual level, there are differences in accessing, processing, and using health information. So these inequalities transfer, and the drivers are class, social class matters, race matters, and place matters in influencing people. This is one piece of data I wanted to show from Pew. For example, this is not a surprise to anybody here. If you're more educated, you're much more likely to know about science. But more interesting, also the idea of intersectionality that feminist scholars have drawn our attention to, that if you are educated and of a particular race, it's even more interesting, right? If you look at the data, African Americans with the highest education still have less knowledge compared to whites with less education. This, in my view, is a systemic problem, right? It is the way we organize the social system that is leading to this kind of a disenfranchisement and oppression, right? So the consequences are very clear. The last point is very critical. The consequences, higher disease incidence, prevalence, and mortality because of this wrong kind of information. So what can we do about it? Quickly, I'll give you 4 solutions, drawing on the projects we have been doing for the last 15 years at Harvard. One is we need a multi-sectoral and multi-level approach. We really have to move away from this individualist focus where we tell people, okay, we will provide the information to you and it is your responsibility, and some kind of a psychological adjustment has to be made so that you know the science accurately. We really have to move away from it. We have to have a laser focus on the underserved, make everybody count, and third, we have to build capacity and infrastructure among institutions for managing science and disseminating science and health information. Number 4, we have to be participatory in our science communication, engage the end users, engage the community, right? This is what an example of a multi-level model may look like. Intersectoral collaborations, we have done work where we showed the problems exist because the collaborations are not, these radio charts are showing that the sectors are not collaborating with each other on these problems. If they don't collaborate in a community context, it's very difficult to disseminate and spread science or health equally to all groups. Second, a laser focus. Our national probability-based sample surveys do not account for underserved enough, and we call them hard to reach people. Our argument is they're hardly reached people because we don't make sufficient efforts to include them in our samples. This is an example just to show that we had to really redo our sampling design to accommodate people from other groups. Third, this is an example of a knowledge hub we have created to translate evidence-based information for use by community groups. Community-based organizations and faith-based organizations are engaged in the process of science, but it's pragmatic science, practical science. They want to use evidence-based in the work they do, whether you are promoting breast cancer screening or diabetes screening, whatever it is, right? We created this knowledge hub to translate science because they're not going to go out and read journal articles, and from these brilliant researchers here. So we need a hub of some kind and engage them right from the beginning in constructing this infrastructure. They have to be at the table here with us as we design the solution. In fact, as we define the problem in the first place, right? And I won't go, in the absence of, in the interest of time, I won't go into this. But the last thing, is to talk about how do you translate science in a way that they can understand. Right? And so we have experimented a number of ways, including the so-called dissemination or knowledge briefs, where we translate science, significant scientific findings, in consultation with the communities and develop these briefs with them so that they can use these briefs on critical scientific topics, either in communicating with their clientele or in testifying at the city council or with the Congress, whoever it is, right? It is a way of translation of science, again, for their benefit, right? So if you are going to do this, I think what we need is a new approach that requires a laser focus on the underserved and whatever term you want to use, but engages communities, whether it's communities of practice or other kinds of communities, and where science communication can be participatory, which means really look around the room. Who is in the room, right? We really need to think about who these end users are and how can we bring them to the table to sit with us right from the very first step onwards. Only then, I think, we can have an effective science communications. Thank you.